by Dr. Tom Evans. He's a graduate of Walla Walla and Andrews University, and he worked with two conferences here in the U.S., the Upper Columbia Conference and the Texas Conference. Currently, he teaches us at Andrews University and is also one of the associate director of NADI, North America Division Evangelism Institute. He will be presenting on God's special trio, foreigners, orphans, and widows. Dr. Evans.
Well, I also chose an Old Testament approach to discipleship, and depending which book you emphasize, you could be talking about a trio or a quartet. So my emphasis will be mainly out of Deuteronomy, which tends to be a trio. So in any case, I noticed that Brazilians are well represented here. My wife is Brazilian, and in fact, I spent much of the time preparing this paper while I was in Brazil recently for two church planting conferences. So it's always exciting to see how God's work is advancing there, and we certainly want to see that happen in every part of the world. The habit of reading the Bible through every year from cover to cover has provided some insights that I might not have picked up without this systematic approach. There are three groups of people that God identifies repeatedly, and they almost are always mentioned together. God is intensely concerned about how his followers respond to these subgroups of humanity. I like to call them God's special trio. They are foreigners, fatherless, and widows. Foreigners, fatherless, and widows appear as a trio in 11 verses of the book of Deuteronomy. It is impossible to miss them when reading through this book. The first verse in which they are mentioned is Deuteronomy 10, verse 18. God's passion is clearly articulated. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. How does God provide for them? It almost sounds like he provides for them directly from this verse. But he calls on his people to supply food for these individuals and emphasizes that by doing so, he will bless them in all the work of their hands. Each local town was expected to respond to the needs of the foreigners, fatherless and widows that lived among them. God's blessing was tied directly to how they responded to each of these groups. God was very specific in his instructions concerning the treatment of his special trio. His people were not to take advantage of them, such as depriving the foreigner and fatherless of justice or taking the cloak of a widow. That's Deuteronomy 24:17. At harvest time, they were not to thoroughly harvest their farms. They were to leave olives, grapes, and wheat available for harvesting by the foreigners, fatherless, and widows. Deuteronomy 24:19, 24:20, and 24:21. A tenth of the harvest was to be given to the Levites for a tithe. From this tenth, the tenth that was given to the Levites, the foreigners, fatherless, and widows were also to be cared for. Deuteronomy 26:12. What intrigued me is that when I came across this trio again, as I continued reading in Psalms, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and Malachi, Psalm 146:9 repeats the response of God found in Deuteronomy 10:18. The Lord watches over the foreigner and sustains the fatherless and the widow. Many verses referring to God's special trio come in the form of a warning. Do not oppress the fatherless, the foreigner, and the widow. Jeremiah 7:5-7 puts it this way: if you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, fatherless, and the widow, And do not shed innocent blood in this place. And if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave to your ancestors forever and ever. A brief survey of the Old Testament perspective on foreigners, fatherless, and widows indicates that these groups are a special focus of God's attention. He expects them to be treated well, not oppressed, and to be provided for by his people. God's blessing of his people is directly connected to how they treat these individuals. Let's explore each of these three groups further, beginning with foreigners. The New International Version selects the word foreigner to describe this group. Other translations use the perhaps not so popular word stranger, but there's other choices as well, including immigrant or sojourner. Leviticus 19:34 provides an insight into what God is referring to here. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. The Hebrew word used in this passage is hagar, which is the same root word gur used in Deuteronomy 10:18 and is best translated as sojourner. This rarely used English word means to turn aside and tarry for a definite or indefinite time. Biblically, this person was a newcomer who didn't have rights that were based on birth. A biblical example of a sojourner is the story of Naomi and Ruth. When Naomi moved her family to Moab because of a famine in Israel, she became a sojourner in Moab. When Ruth, a Moabite, moved with Naomi back to Israel, Ruth became a sojourner. In today's context, refugees or immigrants are familiar words that define groups of people that fit the meaning of the word sojourner, hagar. From the inception of Israel, there was a mandate from God to respond with compassion to the foreigner. God shares his vision for Abraham and his descendants in Genesis 12:3. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. The calling of Israel to positively impact the nations surrounding them was a unique one. Although ancient Near Eastern law codes stress protection of the widow and orphan, only Israel's contained legislation for the resident alien. In our contemporary context, foreigners, and in particular refugees, are making headlines around the world. Despite desperate political conditions in Syria and Libya have created a monumental humanitarian crisis. It is estimated that 11 million Syrians have fled their homes since civil war broke out in March of 2011. In the first 6 weeks of 2016, 409 individuals lost their lives at sea in their attempt to escape. European nations face unprecedented challenges as they scramble to respond compassionately to the cry for help. Joe Millen, a spokesman for the International Organization for Migration, stated, "There are more concurrent crises around than we've ever seen at one time. It is not anticipated that this intensity will decrease anytime soon." Complicating matters further is a legitimate fear that terrorists are infiltrating the refugees as they seek asylum. It is impossible to close a blind eye to the risk while trying to respond compassionately to the millions who desperately need help. It is not the purpose of this article to debate the political landmines related to the current refugee crisis, rather to present a case for a biblical response to this group as part of God's special trio. If we examine the pattern established in the Old Testament, it is abundantly clear that we must respond with acts of compassion. Every city was responsible to care for those within their territory. Applying that methodology today, it would become the responsibility of the local church and individual members to engage in ministry to refugees within their own community. Deuteronomy 10:18 clearly highlights the priority of providing for the physical needs with food and clothing. Additional ways to provide tangible help could be in assisting with medical and dental needs, bed and blankets for the home, helping them learn the language of their new country, orientation of the community, and so on. Inviting a refugee home for a meal would foster a relationship and heighten awareness of specific needs. The Iowa, Missouri Conference has taken decided action to do something tangible for refugees within their territory. They have established a refugee tuition fund that provides assistance for Adventist education to children of refugees. More information can be found by visiting their website, but I remember hearing their conference president state that there are no boundaries when it comes to reaching refugees, and if other conferences would not be involved, that his would be anyway. And in fact, they are paying the salary of somebody doing refugee ministry in a neighboring conference. So it's tremendous to see what is happening there. Seventh-day Adventists are an end-time movement with a mission to carry the three angels' message to the ends of the earth. Could the influx of refugees be God-ordained? Quoting here from Ellen White, God would be pleased to see far more accomplished by his people in the presentation of the truth for this time to the foreigners in America than has been done in the past. As I have testified for years, if we were quick in discerning the opening providence of God, we should be able to see in the multiplying opportunities to reach many foreigners in America a divinely appointed means of rapidly extending the third angel's message into all nations of the earth. God in his providence has brought men to our very doors and thrust them, as it were, into our arms, that they might learn the truth and be qualified to do a work which we could not do in getting the light before men of other tongues. Pastor Jimmy Shui spent over 20 years living in a refugee camp. In fact, I've spoken with him about his desire to write his story, but there are so many elements of it that make it almost dangerous for him to put his story in writing. He is now a United States citizen and lives in North Carolina. Pastor Jimmy understands the significance of the above quote from the book Evangelism. Since 2011, he has been involved in helping to identify 43 Karen refugee groups in the United States. Today, there are over 2,000 Karen refugees worshiping as Seventh-day Adventists in the United States. Are there refugees living in your city? To find out, you can visit the website reachtheworldnextdoor.com, and we have some cards for everybody at the end of the presentation. There's a link there that says Make Friends with Internationals, and then an additional link that says Find Internationals. Perhaps your church could become a host to a refugee group or assist them as they plant a church. Experience has demonstrated that these groups flourish best when supported to begin their own ministry versus integrating them into the worship service of existing Adventist churches. If space could be provided by the local church for them to conduct Sabbath school and church in their own language, they will flourish. And by the way, the translation rate is about 4 words to 1, and this is one of the challenges when we try to incorporate them into our existing worship services. The local church can respond to their physical needs and help them transition to their new home country. This is mission at its best. The second group in God's special trio is the fatherless. This group is close to God's heart. As highlighted previously, the group is referred to as fatherless appeared 18 times in the Old Testament as part of the trilogy of foreigners, fatherless, and widows. The fatherless are mentioned an additional 23 times in the Old Testament. Perhaps the most well-known passage is Psalm 68:5. A father to the fatherless, a defender of the widows, is God in his holy dwelling. Psalm 27:10 sheds further light on God's passion for the fatherless. When my father and my mother forsake me, the Lord will take care of me. In the ancient Near East, the father provided the main economic support for their family. The loss of a father through death in war, accident, or disease placed the children and widow in a desperate financial situation. 2 Kings 4:1-7 shares the hopeless plight of a widow who had creditors coming after her following the death of her husband. The ruthless creditor was even threatening to take her 2 sons as slaves in order to pay the debt. Elisha instructed her to collect vessels and pour the small amount of oil that she had into them. Miraculously, the oil multiplied and all the pots were filled, as she was able to sell the oil and pay off the creditor. Such highly vulnerable widows were to be cared for by God's people. In this case, it seems that help had not come, and God himself provided a miracle to care for the widow and her children. Just as God placed the responsibility of reflecting his passion and coming to the aid of the fatherless in the Old Testament, he clearly indicates the priority for his followers today. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress. James 1:27. According to the Christian Alliance of Orphans, 17.8 million children have lost both parents. These children are referred to as double orphans. 153 million children have lost one or both parents. These numbers do not include children living in institutions, orphanages, or on the street. These children are known as social orphans. How can a Seventh-day Adventist directly impact the life of an orphan today? Christmas of 2014, our family decided to host 2 orphan brothers through an organization called Project 143. Incidentally, they adopted that name when there were 143 million orphans. Now they put a slash through that number, and on their t-shirts it says 153. 153 million. There are a number of other organizations also involved in orphan hosting ministry. The boys came to our home for 4 weeks to live with our family and enjoy the Christmas holidays. The experience was so transformational that for our family that we decided to host them again for 8 weeks during the following summer. And we have now hosted the boy 4 times and also visited their orphanage in Eastern Europe. They have learned English, and one of our biological boys is communicating with them in their language. We're currently in the process of adopting them. Spending time with these boys caused me to wonder how 2 such amazing boys could be abandoned by their parents. They have such promise for the future, but desperately need a family who will love them and raise them to make a difference in the world for God. They come from what is considered to be the most secular part of the world. Praying, going to church, family worship, even the name of Jesus are all new concepts for them. I remember this Christmas, our youngest boy asked me if it was Jesus who was giving special music at Pioneer Memorial Church. It is exciting to see the transformation in their lives during their short time with us. The older boy, who was 7 at the time, came up to me one Sabbath after hearing me preach, and in broken English said, "I help for God." Needless to say, I was overcome with emotion. Perhaps you have an interest in doing something closer to home. Being a foster parent is another way to make an impact for orphans. This ministry for children should certainly be promoted in the local church. If this is not the right step for your family, perhaps you can be a support for someone who is fostering through respite care. Respite means to provide a primary caregiver with a break. By hosting a child in your home for a few hours or over a weekend, you can give the foster parent a much-needed rest, and as a result, not only help the child, but also help the foster parent do their job better. The same need is also present for single parents and their children. Ellen White took the biblical injunction to assist orphans personally. She comments on her experience. After my marriage, I was instructed that I must show a special interest in motherless and fatherless children, taking some under my own charge for a time and then finding homes for them. Thus, I would be giving others an example of what they could do. Although called to travel often and having much writing to do, I have taken children of 3 and 5 years of age and have cared for them, educating them and trained them for responsible positions. I have taken into my home from time to time boys from 10 to 16 years of age, giving them motherly care and training them for service. I have felt it my duty to bring before our people that work for which those of every church should feel a responsibility. While in Australia, I carried on the same line of work, taking into my home orphan children who were in danger of being exposed to temptations that might cause the loss of their souls. Note that it was God who instructed Ellen White to do this. Also, it was to be an example to others of what they could do. She clearly recommends that every church take on the responsibility of ministering to orphans. With the busy life that Ellen White lived, what an inspiration. The final group of God's special trio we will examine further is referred to as widows. In the Old Testament, widows and orphans are typically grouped together. One event precipitated the status of widow and orphan in a moment: the death of the husband and father. At that moment, the future of the wife, now a widow, and the children, now orphans, became very uncertain. Jesus draws our attention to a broader ministry to widows in Luke 4:25 through 26, and he's actually referring back to the Old Testament. But I tell you truly, many widows were in Israel in the day of Elijah. This was not just a small problem. Many widows were there. When the heaven was shut up, and for 3 years and 6 months, there was a great famine throughout all the land. But to none of them was Elijah sent except to Zarephath, to the region of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. Elijah's interaction with the widow in Zarephath resulted in God's miraculous preservation of the widow's life and that of her son. The provision was for their basic need of food. God miraculously supplied oil and flour until the famine ended. In these verses, Jesus emphasizes that there were many widows in Israel. The story of the widow of Zarephath additionally points out that God's care extended beyond the borders of Israel. The plight of widows does not escape God's notice, and it should not escape our notice either. Some women become widows because they still have children living at home. Others become widows because they outlive their spouse who has died of old age. On average, women outlive men by 7 to 10 years. If a man marries a woman that is a few years younger, then the time spent in widowhood can be even longer. The loss of a spouse, having to care for a home alone, and feeling uncertain financially, all can create a very distressing situation. Ideally, children and other family members will rise to the occasion and provide the support needed. However, that should not be assumed. There are many ways that church members can respond with compassion and love. Inviting them to your home for a meal, helping them organize their finances, mowing their yard, doing odd jobs and repairs around the house, preparing food for them, adopting them as a grandparent for your children, taking them on family outings with you, etc. There may be physical needs, but we should also be in tune with the emotional needs. Local churches should provide social and spiritual opportunities for these individuals to interact with others who are facing a similar stage in their life. Beyond our own members, we should be reaching out to widows in the community as well. Our society is impacted by another group that has many similarities to widows: single moms. This group is created by two cultural dynamics: divorce and unwed pregnancies, both of which result in children being raised without a mother and father in the home. Single moms represent a significant portion of society. The Washington Post made this observation: single motherhood has grown so common in America that demographers now believe half of all children will live with a single mom at some point before the age of 18. Here are some startling statistics regarding single moms in America. 78% of the current prison population was raised by single moms. Children of single-parent homes are 5 times more likely to commit suicide and 10 times more likely to drop out of high school. 1/3 of single moms live in poverty. How has the Christian church responded? This is what is startling. Only 1% of the nation's 300,000 evangelical churches have any type of ministry for single moms. 2/3 of single moms don't attend church, which means their children aren't there either. The combined number of unchurched single moms and their children makes this segment of society likely the most under-evangelized unchurched group in America. And yet this is a group with tremendous needs and potential high receptivity. How does the Seventh-day Adventist Church do when it comes to ministering to single moms? Statistics are not available to know the exact percentages, but is likely very similar to the 1% cited above. Research indicates when the church makes an effort to connect with single moms in meaningful ways, that it will bear fruit. Churches with single-parent support groups are twice as likely to retain single parents in their church long-term. Churches with single moms support program have seen a 58% increase in the number of single parents attending church. One of the most innovative Seventh-day Adventist churches ministering to single moms in North America is Church in the Valley, located in Langley, British Columbia. For the past 15 years, through their Acts of Kindness ministry, what they've renamed their community services, single moms in the community have benefited in many ways. One ongoing ministry is that of changing the oil in their vehicles. This ministry is offered at no cost every 6 months. The church also offers free breakfast every school day for children of low-income families at a nearby public school. Most of these children are from single mom homes. This ministry has been ongoing for 15 years. The church also takes donations of vehicles and makes sure they are in good running condition. They then select a single mom to provide the car to as a gift. The most dramatic ministry is extreme home repair. Every year, the church takes nominations from the community of a home that is desperately in need of repair. In most cases, the recipient is a single parent. The church partners together with the community for donations of material and labor, and over the course of 2 weeks, repairs and renovates the home at no cost to the single mom. Videos and an article were recently published in the NAD Ministerial Second Quarter online magazine, if you'd like to learn more about it. In this article, we have explored God's special trio: foreigners, fatherless, and widows. What burden has God placed on your heart? What action will you take? As a church, what tangible ministry will you engage in? Without question, these groups are ones that Jesus highlights in Matthew 25:40. Assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did it for one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. Our actions of compassion toward foreigners, orphans, and widows will truly make an impact for eternity.
Presentation. It is time for questions now.
I've asked Pastor Scott Griswold to hand out a card that highlights some of these groups and is something perhaps you could put in your Bible and remember in prayer.
Yes.
Thank you. Widows, orphans, and the stranger. Can these categories stand more broadly for those who are vulnerable and the other? For example, in contemporary race relations in the United States of America, would these have application to that?
You know, I believe that this segment represents all that are disenfranchised, all that are on the fringes of society. In fact, the poor we could also include in this, but many of these individuals represent the poor. The poverty rate among single moms is so high. So yes, I believe this represents any neglected in society that we have a responsibility to respond to, for sure.
Next question.
I have a question. I know in the United States and even in India, something like widowhood in India or single mom in the U.S., there's so much stigma that's connected to it. Do you have examples? You mentioned the positive outreach of the church in British Columbia. Do you have ideas or examples of how do you overcome the stigma? Because I'm assuming they did that at some point.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be one of the major barriers is there's always this kind of, well, they're like this, or there's a reason, and so on. And then, so to do any outreach, you have to somehow get over that. Do you have some sort of advice?
Yeah. It is a challenge, and most of our churches are not prepared to respond, for example, to single moms. Some of the research shows that most of them will give the church one try, and immediately they don't feel welcomed, they don't feel there's a place for them, and they don't come back again. So it's very unfortunate. So we will need to adjust some of our approaches. Really, I believe there's two ways that we can minister to this group effectively. One is through a local church ministry. And to do this effectively, we need to train our people how to respond, because they don't know how to respond because they're not single moms themselves. One of the ways we find out how to respond is to talk to a single mom. For example, having a breakfast at the church when they arrive with their children would be a great way to respond to one of their needs so that they're not having to worry about grabbing breakfast on the way out the door. Just a simple thing that can help meet that need. A second way we can respond, I think, effectively is through planting churches that focus on this particular group. Everett Samuel is in Greater New York Conference, and she is planting a church to reach single moms. And most of their children so far, of the women that she's been reaching, have disabilities. So she's even found a little bit of a niche that way. Certainly in a city that large, there's many people that fit that demographic. So we're very excited about that. So we've invited Everett Samuel to be one of our presenters for our Seeds Church planning conferences to raise awareness. So a lady by the name of Jennifer Maggio is the most well-known advocate of single moms in the United States. She had 4 abortions by the time she was 19 years old and was living on the streets. Subsequently, she became a corporate executive, and John Maxwell named her as one of the top 10 most influential individuals in the United States. She has a mission to start support groups for single moms in local church settings and has begun to see some tremendous results with that approach. But we need to train our members how to respond. That's the bottom line.
Thank you. Next question. Yes, Scott.
Just a comment connecting the previous paper to yours that seems to really fit with the Shema approach of doing it in the family. The approach to caring for the poor is a family community basis. Isaiah 58 makes that connection to bring the homeless wanderer into your home. So the idea of discipleship is home-based but community-focused.
Very good. It's true. And I think even the New Testament, when you look at the word hospitality, the breakdown of that word as it's used is a love of strangers. So it's not about being hospitable among ourselves only. It's about looking for those people that have those needs and responding to them. And so yes, the whole family can do that. And I can testify the transformation for our 2 boys by having orphans in our home and being able to minister to them and see their needs and their need for a parent and a family. It's been transformational for our family, so that's very true. I think we saw a hand over here. There's some. Yes, you have the microphone in the back, so we go there.
So oftentimes when we do ministry, we set it up as a program, and we're finding that programs don't work too well. How do we reach out to single moms in our community? And I work with a church in Benton Harbor, so single moms are prevalent in that community. How would you recommend we reach out to that community, but it not be a program per se? I mean,
right.
Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah. Really as we look at how we structure local church ministry, there's certain things that organizationally we can do to facilitate reaching people, and those things are programs. So we don't want to do something without a program. However, it's not enough if we really want to seed that kind of missional DNA within our churches. It needs to be inculcated in the lives of our members, which I believe best happens through modeling. And so if there's somebody that has a passion for that and is able to build relationships, as Pastor Scott mentioned, by inviting somebody to their home, by making a friendship, and then to begin to expand that and include others to experience that. We were interested, just the fact that we were hosting these orphans in our home inspired another family that they should adopt. They'd been thinking about it, and when they heard that we were doing this, they've already completed the adoption on their child. But it was that modeling of we're doing this, we have these children with us that are orphans, or we're reaching this family, or we're paying attention to this single mom. I know right here in our own community at the seminary, sometime there'll be a spouse that will pass away. And we don't want to forget the lady of the family that now is alone, right? And I've had a number of conversations with one of those individuals over the past couple of weeks. But that's something, again, that we need to model and then invite others to participate in so they become inspired as well to be a part of that kind of ministry. Yes?
I think it's a wonderful opportunity and a blessing to give our helping hands to those 3 groups and others who are marginalized. On the other hand, we as human beings with shortcomings as well encounter some problems of setting a healthy boundary. So for example, probably they have been helped by different groups, and at a certain point they may just take it for granted, and sometimes they kind of demand their right to be supported, and at that point we might be kind of be disappointed or I don't know how to put it. So how can we set this healthy boundary so that they can be helped, and we as a local church can also continue to be encouraged to support them?
Yeah. Well, I think that the danger, at least for the local church, of that challenge is demonstrated in that only 1% of churches have any kind of ministry at all. So we're not doing enough as a local church. I think certainly there are government programs that can create a dependency, and I think it ties into the previous question and comment that programs themselves can create this kind of dependency. But I think when we individually engage, we can help the person move forward in their life, because they really, for their own health and well-being, probably don't want to stay there. And if we can help them move forward, and if we have that personal relationship, I think that we can make individual choices on what's appropriate, what's helpful, what's not helpful. But I think programs themselves, by nature, can set themselves up to be taken advantage of and to be dependent on. So I would make that distinction, I think.
I have a quick question. I see in the presentation that you use fatherless and orphan interchangeably. I would like to ask if when you are motherless, if you are not considered an orphan.
I missed the last half, sorry.
If a child without a mother, is he or she considered orphan? Or is it only when you...
Yes, there's a distinction of the double orphan who's lost both parents, and then of course there's the orphan that's lost only one parent. And so yes, it's certainly if there's one parent, they would still be at somewhat of an orphan. They would be at an orphan status in that sense, because you need both parents to be considered to have that. But again, orphans, there's an abandonment issue that comes, and that's a different issue than somebody who's a single mom or a single parent, where the child is not abandoned. But certainly there's extra support that still is needed for those individuals. But an orphan would be one that, truly an orphan would be one that's completely abandoned.
Okay. It's because in the presentation you use either fatherless or orphan. I would like to know if they did the same thing.
Yeah, good.